Welcome to Echoes of Dharma. Right now, as you listen to these words, your mind is doing something extraordinary. It's creating a constant stream of thoughts, judgments, and reactions that never seems to stop. But here's what might surprise you. This endless mental chatter that fills your head from morning until night might be the very thing preventing you from finding the peace you're searching for. Think about yesterday. How many words did you speak? How many thoughts raced through your mind? How many times did you find yourself mentally arguing with someone, planning future conversations, or replaying past discussions? If you're like most people, your mind barely stopped moving for even a moment. Now, imagine this. What if I told you that somewhere in ancient India, there lived a king who discovered something so powerful that it transformed his entire existence? This wasn't magic or mysticism. This was a practical discovery about the human mind that Buddhist monks have been teaching for over 2,000 years. This king had everything you might dream of having: unlimited wealth, absolute power, armies at his command, and the respect of millions. Yet he was miserable. His mind tormented him day and night with restless thoughts, endless worries, and a deep sense that something was fundamentally wrong with his life. But here's where this story becomes fascinating for your own life. This king stumbled upon a secret that changed everything. Not through acquiring more possessions, not through gaining more power, not through talking his way out of problems, but through discovering something he had never truly experienced before. Something that exists within you right now, waiting to be discovered. Are you ready to discover what happens when a mind that has never known peace finally learns the secret of silence? In the heart of ancient India, when kingdoms stretched like golden tapestries across the land, there ruled a king whose story would echo through Buddhist monasteries for centuries to come. This was not just any ruler. This was a man who possessed everything the world could offer, yet found himself trapped in a prison of his own making. Picture this king in his magnificent palace, surrounded by marble pillars that reached toward the heavens, walls adorned with precious gems that caught the light like captured stars. Every morning, servants would wake him with gentle music, dress him in the finest silks, and present him with golden platters of the most exquisite foods. Yet as his eyes opened each day, the first thing he felt was not gratitude or joy, but a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. His mind would immediately begin its familiar dance of chaos. Before his feet even touched the palace floor, thoughts would flood his consciousness like a rushing river. What problems await me today? Which advisor will bring me troubling news? What decisions must I make that will affect thousands of lives? The mental chatter would begin before he was even fully awake, and it would not stop until exhaustion finally claimed him at night. This is what Buddhist teachings call the monkey mind, a consciousness that swings endlessly from branch to branch, never finding rest, never finding peace. The ancient masters understood that when our thoughts jump constantly from one worry to another, from one problem to the next, we lose touch with the present moment entirely. We become slaves to our own mental activity, believing that this constant thinking is somehow productive or necessary. But here's what makes this king's story so relevant to your own life. He had convinced himself that this constant mental activity was necessary, that this endless stream of thoughts and words was what made him powerful. How often do you find yourself in the same trap? How often do you believe that staying busy mentally, always thinking, always planning, always worrying, is somehow keeping you safe or in control. Every day brought an endless parade of people seeking his attention. Ministers would approach with urgent matters of state, each one requiring his immediate response. Merchants would present their proposals, each one demanding his consideration. Citizens would come with their disputes, each one needing his judgment. And the king, believing that his worth came from his ability to respond, to decide, to speak with authority, would engage with each person, each problem, each demand for his attention. But notice what was happening to his inner world. With each conversation, with each decision, with each word spoken, the king felt something draining away from him. He began to notice that the more he spoke, the more scattered his thoughts became. The more decisions he made, the less certain he felt about anything. The more he tried to solve problems through talking, the more problems seemed to multiply. This is a profound teaching from Zen Buddhism about the nature of energy and consciousness. When we constantly pour our life force outward, through words, through reactions, through endless mental activity, we disconnect from the source of our true power. The Buddha taught that our energy is like water in a vessel. When we constantly pour it out, without allowing it to be replenished through stillness and silence, we eventually find ourselves empty. Think about your own experience. Have you ever noticed how drained you feel after a day of constant talking, constant thinking, constant mental activity? Have you ever wondered why some conversations leave you feeling energized, while others leave you feeling depleted? The king was experiencing what happens when we mistake activity for effectiveness, noise for wisdom, constant doing for meaningful being. At night, when the palace finally grew quiet and the last advisor had departed, the king would lie in his luxurious bed, feeling more exhausted than the poorest laborer in his kingdom. His mind would replay the day's conversations, analyzing every word spoken to him, planning responses to problems that might never arise, worrying about decisions that had already been made. Sleep would come fitfully, if at all, and his dreams would be filled with the same restless energy that plagued his waking hours. But here's what the king didn't understand yet, and this is something that might transform your own relationship with your mind. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that thoughts are not commands. They are simply phenomena arising and passing away in consciousness, like clouds moving across the sky. The king had become enslaved by his own mental activity, believing that every thought required his attention. Every problem demanded his immediate response. In Zen Buddhism, there's a beautiful teaching that compares the mind to the sky and thoughts to clouds. The sky remains vast and unchanging, whether it's filled with storm clouds or completely clear. Similarly, our true nature, our essential awareness, remains peaceful and undisturbed, whether our minds are busy or quiet. The king had forgotten this truth, identifying completely with the clouds and losing sight of the sky. The most tragic part of the king's situation was that he had become addicted to his own mental suffering. The constant stream of thoughts, worries, and mental chatter had become so familiar that he couldn't imagine existing without it. He had forgotten that underneath all this mental noise, there was something else, a deeper part of himself that remained untouched by the chaos of his thinking mind. This deeper self is what Buddhist teachings call our Buddha nature, the awareness that exists before thought, the consciousness that remains peaceful even when the mind is turbulent. But the king had buried this truth so deeply under layers of mental activity that he had forgotten it existed. As months passed, the king's condition worsened, his ability to concentrate diminished, his joy in simple pleasures disappeared. His relationships with others became strained because he was always distracted, always somewhere else mentally, always preparing his next response instead of truly listening. He had become a prisoner of his own success, trapped by the very things he thought defined his power. But then something extraordinary happened. During a festival celebrating the harvest season, when his kingdom was filled with visitors from distant lands, the king heard something that would change his life forever. A simple story, whispered among travelers, about a man who had discovered something that seemed impossible in a world of constant noise and endless demands. What could this mysterious figure have found that would capture the attention of a king who had access to the greatest wisdom teachers of his time? What discovery could be so powerful that it would pull him away from everything he thought he knew about himself and send him on a journey into the unknown? It was during the Festival of Lights, when the entire kingdom celebrated with joy and laughter, that the king first heard the whisper that would change his destiny. Among the crowds of merchants, travelers, and pilgrims who had come to his capital, there was talk of a mysterious figure, a Buddhist monk who lived deep in the forest, far from the world of men. The stories about this monk were unlike anything the king had heard. Travelers spoke of a man who possessed a peace so profound that merely being in his presence could calm the most troubled heart. They said he rarely spoke, yet when he did, his words carried the weight of mountains and the gentleness of morning dew. Most intriguingly, they said he had mastered something that seemed impossible: complete inner silence. But here's what made these stories so compelling to the king's restless mind. These weren't tales of magic or supernatural powers. These were accounts of a very human transformation. The travelers described a man who had once been much like the king himself: successful, wealthy, constantly busy, always speaking, always thinking, always restless. Yet somehow, he had discovered a secret that transformed his entire existence. In Zen Buddhism, such a being is called a silent thunder, one whose very presence speaks louder than any words. The ancient masters understood that true power doesn't come from the ability to speak eloquently or think quickly, but from the capacity to remain centered in the midst of chaos. This monk had apparently achieved what the Buddha himself taught was the highest accomplishment: the ability to be completely present, completely aware, completely at peace. As the king listened to these stories night after night, he found himself experiencing something he had never felt before, a deep longing for something he couldn't even name. Have you ever felt this way? Have you ever heard about someone who seemed to have found a peace that you desperately craved but couldn't quite understand? The king was experiencing what Buddhist teachings call the awakening of spiritual hunger, the recognition that material success cannot fill the emptiness within. One particular story captured the king's imagination completely. A merchant from a distant village told of visiting this monk during a time of great personal crisis. The merchant had lost his fortune, his family was suffering, and his mind was consumed with worry and despair. He had sought out the monk, expecting to receive advice, solutions, or at least comforting words. But the monk had done something unexpected. Instead of offering immediate answers, he had simply sat with the merchant in complete silence for hours. The merchant described how, gradually, something extraordinary happened. Without any words being spoken, without any advice being given, he began to feel a profound sense of peace settling over him. His racing thoughts slowed down, his anxiety melted away, and he found himself experiencing a clarity and calmness he had never known before. This story illustrates one of the most powerful principles in Buddhist practice, the transmission of peace through presence. The Buddha taught that our inner state affects everyone around us, often more powerfully than our words or actions. When someone has achieved true inner silence, they become like a still pond that reflects the sky. Their very being invites others to discover their own natural peace. The king's curiosity grew into an obsession. Night after night, he would find himself thinking about this mysterious monk. What had he discovered? How had he achieved such peace? What was this power of silence that seemed to elude everyone else? The king began to realize that, despite all his wealth and power, he had never experienced anything like the peace these travelers described. But here's where the story becomes deeply relevant to your own spiritual journey. The king was beginning to understand that everything he had been seeking, happiness, fulfillment, true power, might not come from external achievements, but from something internal that he had never explored. How often do we search for peace in all the wrong places? How often do we believe that if we just achieve one more goal, acquire one more thing, or solve one more problem, then we'll finally be happy? The Buddhist teaching of the Four Noble Truths begins with the recognition that suffering exists, and that this suffering comes from our endless craving for things to be different than they are. The king was beginning to see that his restless mind, his constant need to talk and think and worry, was actually a form of craving, a desperate attempt to control his experience through mental activity. Against the advice of his ministers, who feared for his safety and questioned his judgment, the king made a decision that would change everything. He would leave his palace, his comfort, his familiar world, and venture into the unknown forest to find this monk. It was a decision that required tremendous courage, because it meant confronting something he had been avoiding his entire life, true solitude with his own mind. The journey through the forest was more challenging than the king had imagined. For the first time in years, he was alone with his thoughts, without the constant distraction of court life, without the endless stream of people seeking his attention. And what he discovered during those quiet hours of travel was both terrifying and illuminating. Without the familiar noise and busyness of palace life, the king's mind seemed to become even more active. Thoughts crashed through his consciousness like wild animals, each one demanding attention, each one pulling him in a different direction. But for the first time, he was able to observe this mental chaos without being completely consumed by it. This is what Buddhist meditation teaches us about the nature of mind. When we first begin to pay attention to our thoughts, we often discover that our minds are far more chaotic than we realized. But this recognition is actually the first step toward freedom. We cannot change what we don't acknowledge. As the king traveled deeper into the forest, something began to shift. The natural silence of the woods, broken only by the gentle sounds of birds and rustling leaves, began to have an effect on his restless mind. He found himself walking more slowly, breathing more deeply, and experiencing moments of unexpected peace. But when the king finally reached the monastery deep in the forest, what he found there would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, about wisdom, and about the nature of the human mind itself. The encounter that awaited him would not only transform his own life, but would become a teaching that would guide seekers for generations to come. The monastery was unlike anything the king had ever seen. It was not built of marble and gold like his palaces. but of simple wood and stone, nestled among towering trees that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. The very air felt different here, thick with silence, heavy with peace, alive with a presence that the king couldn't quite understand. As he approached the simple wooden gates, the king noticed something extraordinary. His mind, which had been racing throughout the entire journey, began to quiet down without any effort on his part. It was as if the monastery itself radiated a calming energy that touched something deep within him. In Buddhist teachings, this is called a sacred space, a place where countless hours of meditation and mindful living have created an atmosphere of profound peace. When the king first laid eyes on the monk, he was struck by something that challenged everything he thought he knew about power and presence. This was not a man who had withdrawn from the world in defeat, but someone who radiated a strength that the king had never encountered. The monk's eyes held the depth of still water. His movements flowed like gentle wind, and around him hung an aura of such profound calm that it seemed to silence even the king's restless thoughts. But what struck the king most powerfully was the quality of the monk's attention. When their eyes met, the king felt truly seen for the first time in his life. Not seen as a king, not seen as a powerful ruler, but seen as a human being carrying a heavy burden of suffering. The monk's gaze was completely present, completely accepting, without judgment or expectation. In Zen Buddhism, this is called Buddha nature, the inherent peace and wisdom that exists within every human being, but which is usually hidden beneath layers of mental noise and worldly distraction. The king was witnessing what a human being could become when they learned to access this deeper nature. Think about the people in your own life who have this quality, that rare ability to be completely present, to listen without agenda, to offer their full attention as a gift. The monk greeted the king not with the elaborate ceremonies he was accustomed to, but with a simple bow and a smile that seemed to see straight through to his soul. There was no fanfare, no recognition of his royal status, no attempt to impress or flatter, just pure, authentic human connection. For a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, this simple authenticity was both refreshing and unsettling. When the king began to speak, pouring out his frustrations, his sleepless nights, his endless mental torment, the monk simply listened. But this wasn't the distracted listening the king was used to from his advisors, who were always preparing their responses while he spoke. This was something entirely different, a quality of attention that seemed to create space for the king's words, allowing them to be heard fully and completely. The Buddhist practice of deep listening teaches us that true hearing is an act of love. When we listen with our full presence, without judgment, without the need to fix or solve or respond, we offer one of the greatest gifts possible, the gift of being truly witnessed. The monk's listening created a sanctuary where the king's suffering could be expressed without shame or fear. "Respected monk," the king said, his voice heavy with desperation, "I have everything a man could want, yet I feel as though I am dying inside. My mind never stops racing, my thoughts never bring me peace, and my words seem to create more problems than they solve. I have sought wisdom from the greatest scholars, consulted the most learned advisors, yet nothing brings me the peace I seek. Please, help me understand why I cannot find rest." The monk sat in silence for a long moment, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood something profound that the king had yet to learn. In Zen Buddhism, this is called the pause before wisdom, The recognition that sometimes the most powerful response is not immediate reaction, but thoughtful silence. The monk understood that hasty words, even well-intentioned ones, often miss the mark entirely. This moment of silence was itself a teaching. In our world of instant responses and quick fixes, we have forgotten the power of the pause. We react immediately to everything, believing that speed of response equals wisdom or caring. But the monk's silence taught the king something profound, that true wisdom often requires space, reflection, and the courage to sit with uncertainty. When the monk finally spoke, his words were like drops of water on parched earth. "Your Majesty, you already hold the answer within you, but you have never discovered it. You seek peace in the wrong place. You look for silence in the world around you, but the silence you need exists within you. I want to do an experiment with you. Are you willing to discover what you have been missing all your life?" These words contained a profound Buddhist teaching about the nature of seeking and finding. The Buddha taught that we suffer because we constantly look outside ourselves for what can only be found within. We seek peace in external circumstances, happiness in achievements, wisdom in books and teachers. But true peace, lasting happiness, and genuine wisdom arise from recognizing our own essential nature. The king, desperate for any solution and deeply moved by the monk's presence, agreed immediately. But what the monk proposed next would challenge everything the king thought he knew about himself, about power, and about the nature of true strength. The monk's prescription was so simple, yet so radical, that it would become one of the most powerful teachings in all of Buddhist wisdom. For the next 15 days, the monk said with gentle authority, "You will remain here in my monastery. You will live as we live, simply, quietly, peacefully. Most importantly, you will speak as little as possible and spend long hours in complete silence. You will discover what lies beneath the constant noise of your thinking mind." The king's immediate reaction was disbelief. He had traveled all this way, left his kingdom, sought out this renowned teacher, and this was the wisdom he was offered. Silence. But something in the monk's presence, that unshakable calm, that profound certainty, made the king pause before rejecting the idea. "But how can silence solve my problems?" the king asked. "I have a kingdom to run, decisions to make, people depending on my words and commands. How can not speaking bring me the peace I seek?" The monk smiled, an expression that held centuries of wisdom. "Your Majesty, you have spent your entire life believing that words are power. But what if I told you that the greatest power lies not in what you say, but in what you choose not to say? What if the peace you seek has been waiting for you in the spaces between your words?" This teaching touches on one of the most profound principles in Buddhist philosophy, the concept of emptiness or spaciousness. Not emptiness as in void or nothingness, but emptiness as in openness, potential, the fertile silence from which all wisdom arises. The king was about to discover that silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything. In Zen Buddhism, there is a famous saying that the most important teaching is the one that cannot be spoken. Truth, peace, and wisdom cannot be fully captured in words because they are living experiences that must be directly encountered. The monk was offering the king not another concept to understand, but a direct path to experiencing his own true nature. Reluctantly, yet with growing curiosity about what he might discover, The king agreed to the experiment. He had no idea that this simple commitment to silence would unlock secrets about his own mind that would transform not only his own life, but would become teachings that would guide spiritual seekers for generations to come. The most profound journey of his life was about to begin. The king was given simple robes, a small cell with just the basic necessities, and most challenging of all, a commitment to spend most of his waking hours in complete silence. No servants to command, no advisors to consult, no endless stream of people seeking his attention, just him, alone with his mind. For a man who had spent his entire life defining himself through words and actions, this was like asking him to breathe underwater. The first day was unlike anything the king had ever experienced. As dawn broke over the monastery, painting the sky in gentle shades of gold and pink, the king found himself sitting in his simple cell, surrounded by a silence so complete it felt almost overwhelming. Without the constant distraction of conversation, without the familiar rhythm of giving orders and receiving reports, his mind seemed to rebel against the stillness. Thoughts crashed through his consciousness like wild horses breaking free from their stable. Each one demanded attention, each one pulled him in a different direction. What was happening in his kingdom right now? Were his ministers making the right decisions? What problems were arising that needed his immediate attention? The mental chatter that had always been there suddenly seemed deafeningly loud in the absence of external noise. This is what Buddhist teaching calls the initial rebellion of the untrained mind. When we first attempt to be still, to be silent, to simply be present, the mind often becomes more agitated, not less. It's like trying to see the bottom of a pond that has been stirred up. The more we stir it in our attempt to see clearly, the muddier it becomes. The king was experiencing what every serious meditator encounters, the shock of discovering just how chaotic our inner world really is. But the monk had prepared him for this. The mind is like a jar of muddy water, he had explained. When you constantly shake it with thoughts and words, the water remains cloudy. But when you allow it to be still, the mud settles and the water becomes clear. The first day will be difficult because your mind has forgotten how to be still. Have you ever tried to quiet your mind and found that it seemed to become even more active? This is not a sign of failure. It's a sign of awakening awareness. For the first time, the king was actually noticing the constant stream of mental activity that had always been there but had been masked by external distractions. In Zen Buddhism, this recognition is considered a crucial first step. You cannot transform what you do not first acknowledge. As the hours passed, something unexpected began to happen. The king started to notice that he was not his thoughts. There was something in him that was watching the thoughts, observing the mental chaos, remaining somehow separate from the storm of mental activity. This was his first glimpse of what Buddhist teachings call the witness consciousness, the part of us that can observe our thoughts and emotions without being consumed by them. This discovery was revolutionary for a man who had spent his entire life believing that he was his thoughts, that his identity was completely wrapped up in his mental activity. Suddenly, he began to see that thoughts are like clouds passing through the sky of consciousness. They arise, they pass through, and they disappear, but the sky itself remains unchanged. The king was beginning to discover that he was not the clouds of thought, but the vast sky of awareness itself. On the second day, the king's experience began to shift. The initial panic of mental rebellion was giving way to something subtler but equally challenging. Without his usual defenses of constant talking and thinking, emotions that he had been suppressing for years began to surface. Sadness about missed opportunities, anger about past injustices, fear about uncertainties, feelings that had been buried under layers of mental busyness suddenly demanded his attention. In Buddhist psychology, this is understood as the natural process of purification that occurs when the mind begins to settle. When we stop running from our inner experience through constant distraction, we create space for suppressed emotions to finally be felt and released. The king was learning that true silence is not about suppressing thoughts and feelings, but about creating a spacious awareness that can hold whatever arises without resistance. The third day brought another profound shift. As the king sat in the monastery garden, surrounded by the gentle sounds of nature, he began to notice something extraordinary. Without the constant need to speak, to react, to form opinions about everything around him, his awareness began to expand in ways he had never imagined possible. For the first time in his adult life, the king truly saw a flower. Not just glanced at it, not just recognized it as decoration, but actually saw it. The intricate patterns of its petals, the way morning dew caught the early sunlight, the subtle fragrance that seemed to carry messages from some deeper reality. This is what Zen Buddhism calls direct experience, perception that is not filtered through the constant commentary of the thinking mind. Have you ever had moments like this? Times when you suddenly saw something familiar as if for the first time. When the mental chatter stopped long enough for you to actually experience the miracle of what was right in front of you. The king was discovering that silence doesn't diminish our experience of life, it enriches it beyond measure. The monk had told him something that now began to make sense. When we are always speaking, always thinking, always reacting, we miss the miracle of what is actually happening right here, right now. Silence is not about shutting down, it's about opening up to what has always been present but hidden beneath the noise. By the fourth day, the king began to experience something that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Periods of genuine inner quiet began to emerge. Not the forced silence of suppression, but the natural stillness that arises when the mind is no longer driven by compulsive thinking. These moments were brief at first, lasting only seconds, but they gave him a taste of something he had never known existed: true peace of mind. In these moments of inner stillness, the king discovered what Buddhist teachings call the gap between thoughts, spaces of pure awareness that exist naturally in consciousness, but are usually overlooked in our rush from one thought to the next. These gaps, the ancient masters taught, are doorways to our true nature, windows into the vast spaciousness of our essential being. As the first week progressed, the king began to understand why the monk had prescribed silence rather than more talking, more analysis, more mental effort. Every word we speak, every thought we chase, every reaction we have creates ripples in the pond of consciousness. Only in stillness can we see clearly to the bottom. Only in silence can we hear the voice of our deepest wisdom. But even more profound transformations awaited him. The real journey into the depths of his own being was just beginning. What he would discover in the second week would challenge everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality itself. By the eighth day, something extraordinary began to happen to the king's consciousness. The initial rebellion of his mind had settled, the suppressed emotions had been acknowledged and released, and now he was entering territory that was completely unknown to him. The silence was no longer something he had to force or maintain. It was beginning to feel natural, even nourishing. On this morning, as the king sat in meditation in the pre-dawn darkness, something shifted so profoundly that it would change his understanding of reality forever. For several minutes, he realized later, he had not been thinking at all. He had simply been present, aware, alive, in a way that felt completely natural, yet utterly new. It was as if he had been living his entire life in a small, noisy room, and had suddenly discovered that there was a vast, peaceful landscape just outside the door. This experience corresponds to what Zen Buddhism calls samadhi, a state of meditative absorption where the sense of separation between the observer and the observed dissolves. The king was no longer trying to meditate or forcing himself to be silent. He had become silence itself. His awareness had expanded beyond the boundaries of his individual thoughts and merged with something infinitely larger and more peaceful. But what made this experience so transformative was not just the temporary peace it brought. It was the recognition that this vast, silent awareness had always been there, waiting beneath the surface of his mental chatter. The Buddhist teaching is clear on this point. We don't create peace through meditation. We uncover the peace that is our natural state. The king was discovering his own Buddha nature, the inherent wisdom and compassion that exists within every human being. Think about your own moments of profound peace. Perhaps watching a sunset, holding a newborn child, or experiencing the depth of love. In those moments, did you feel as though you had found something new, or did it feel more like remembering something you had always known? The king was experiencing this recognition on the deepest possible level, the remembering of his own true nature. On the 9th day, the king's transformation became evident in his interactions with the world around him. He was walking slowly through the forest when he encountered an injured bird struggling on the ground. His first instinct was to call for help, to give orders, to take action through words and commands. But something made him pause. Instead of speaking, he simply sat with the bird, his presence gentle and calm. To his amazement, the bird seemed to sense his peaceful energy and became still. Without any words being spoken, without any dramatic intervention, the king found himself simply being present with the creature's suffering. And in that presence, something healing occurred, not just for the bird, but for the king himself. He was discovering what Buddhist teachings call compassionate presence, the power to help simply by being fully present, without agenda or attachment to outcome. This experience illustrates one of the most profound teachings in all of Buddhism, that our inner state affects everything around us. When we are truly peaceful, that peace radiates outward and touches everyone and everything in our environment. The king was learning that sometimes the most powerful action is non-action. The most healing words are no words, and the greatest strength comes from stillness. After sitting with the bird for nearly an hour, the king gently helped it to safety. But what struck him most was not what he had done, but how he had been. For the first time in his life, he had responded to a situation not from his habitual patterns of mental analysis and verbal commands, but from a deeper place of wisdom and compassion. He had acted from silence rather than noise, from peace rather than anxiety, from wisdom rather than reaction. The 10th day brought another breakthrough. The king woke to find that his mind was not immediately flooded with thoughts about his kingdom, his responsibilities, or his problems. Instead, There was a quality of spacious awareness that seemed to encompass everything without being disturbed by anything. He had discovered what the Zen masters call original mind consciousness in its natural state, before it becomes clouded by thoughts, opinions, and reactions. In this state of natural awareness, the king began to understand something that would revolutionize his approach to leadership and life. He saw clearly how his constant talking, his compulsive thinking, his need to always have an opinion or solution had actually been creating more problems than they solved. In Buddhist psychology, this is called the wisdom of non-interference, the understanding that sometimes the kindest and most effective response is to simply be present without trying to fix or change anything. Have you ever noticed how some people have the ability to be with you in your difficulties without trying to solve your problems or give you advice? How their simple presence somehow makes you feel better, even though they haven't said much. The king was developing this quality, the capacity to offer his full presence as a gift, without the need to impress or intervene. By the 11th day, the transformation in the king's consciousness was so complete that even the monk began to take notice. The restless energy that had characterized the king's presence when he first arrived had been replaced by a quality of stillness that seemed to emanate from deep within. His movements had become more graceful, his breathing had deepened, and his eyes had acquired a depth and clarity that spoke of profound inner peace. But perhaps most remarkably, when the king did speak, during the brief periods when conversation was necessary, his words carried a weight and wisdom that they had never possessed before. In Zen Buddhism, this is called right speech, words that arise from silence, that are born from wisdom rather than compulsion, that heal rather than harm. The king was learning that silence doesn't make our words less powerful, it makes them infinitely more so. On the 12th morning, as the king sat in meditation, something occurred that would become the crowning experience of his entire retreat. His eyes closed naturally, and he entered into a state of such profound stillness that time seemed to stop. In this deep, meditative absorption, all sense of being a separate self dissolved. There was no king, no problems, no kingdom. There was only pure awareness, vast and peaceful as the sky itself. This experience of ego dissolution is what Buddhist teachings point to as the ultimate truth of our existence, that our separate sense of self is actually an illusion, and that our true nature is this vast, interconnected awareness. The king had touched the deepest teaching of Buddhism, the recognition that suffering comes from our identification with the small self, and that freedom comes from recognizing our true nature as unlimited consciousness. When he emerged from this profound state, the king knew with absolute certainty that his life had been forever changed. He had discovered something that no external achievement could ever provide, the unshakable peace that comes from knowing one's true nature. But even more importantly, he had learned something that would transform how he lived and led for the rest of his life. The final days of his retreat would bring integration and understanding. But the real question now was how to carry this profound transformation back into the world of action and responsibility. How could he maintain this inner silence while still fulfilling his duties as a king? The answer would surprise him and provide one of the most practical teachings in all of Buddhist wisdom. On the 13th day, as the king's transformative journey neared its end, he found himself experiencing something that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier. He woke naturally before dawn, not with the familiar weight of anxiety pressing down on his chest, but with a sense of lightness and clarity that seemed to emanate from his very core. The constant mental chatter that had dominated his consciousness for years had been replaced by a spacious awareness that felt both peaceful and vibrantly alive. For the first time since beginning this experiment, the king allowed himself to truly reflect on what had transpired. As he sat in the monastery garden, watching the sun paint the morning sky in gentle pastels, insights began arising in his consciousness with the clarity of mountain springs. These weren't the forced conclusions of analytical thinking, but natural recognitions emerging from the silence he had cultivated. The first realization struck him with stunning clarity. He had been living his entire life backwards. Everything he had believed about power, about leadership, about what made him valuable as a human being, had been fundamentally mistaken. He had thought that his worth came from his ability to speak, to decide, to control through words and actions. But now he understood that true power comes from the capacity to remain centered, peaceful, and aware, regardless of external circumstances. In Buddhist teaching, this recognition is called the reversal of ordinary understanding. Most people believe that happiness comes from getting what we want and avoiding what we don't want. But the deeper truth is that lasting peace comes from developing equanimity, the ability to remain balanced and serene, whether circumstances are pleasant or unpleasant. The king was discovering that he had been seeking external solutions to what was fundamentally an internal condition, but his insights went even deeper. As he reflected on his years of constant talking, endless meetings, and compulsive decision-making, he began to see how much energy he had wasted. Every unnecessary word he had spoken, every reaction he had given to minor provocations, every time he had filled silence with nervous chatter, all of this had been like pouring water through a broken vessel. He had been hemorrhaging his life force through unconscious speech and compulsive mental activity. Have you ever noticed how drained you feel after certain conversations? How some interactions leave you feeling energized while others seem to suck the life out of you? The king was recognizing that most of his daily communication had been unconscious, reactive rather than responsive, driven by habit rather than wisdom. In Buddhist psychology, this is understood as one of the primary ways we create suffering for ourselves and others. The king began to understand what the Buddha meant when he taught about right speech as one of the essential elements of the spiritual path. Right speech isn't just about avoiding lies or harsh words. It's about speaking only when speech serves a genuine purpose, when it arises from wisdom rather than compulsion, when it heals rather than harms. He realized that probably 90% of his daily talking had been unnecessary, even counterproductive. This recognition led to an even more profound insight about the nature of his restless mind. He saw clearly now that his constant need to talk, to think, to analyze, to control had actually been a form of addiction. Just as some people become dependent on external substances, he had become dependent on mental activity. The silence had shown him that he could exist, and exist more fully, without this constant mental noise. In Zen Buddhism, this addiction to thinking is understood as one of the fundamental forms of human suffering. We become so identified with our thoughts that we forget there is anything else. We mistake the endless commentary in our heads for reality itself. The king was experiencing the liberation that comes from recognizing that thoughts are simply phenomena arising in consciousness, not the truth of who we are. But perhaps his most revolutionary insight concerned the relationship between silence and effectiveness. He had always believed that constant activity, constant communication, constant mental engagement were necessary for good leadership. Now he understood that the opposite was true. The most effective leaders, the wisest decision-makers, the most compassionate human beings are those who can access the stillness within themselves and act from that place of centered awareness. This teaching is central to Buddhist philosophy, that action arising from stillness is infinitely more powerful than action arising from agitation. When we act from a place of inner peace, our actions are more skillful, more appropriate to the situation, more likely to produce beneficial results. The king was beginning to understand that he could return to his kingdom and be a more effective ruler precisely because he had learned to access this inner silence. On the 14th day, the king experienced something that confirmed all of his insights. A messenger arrived at the monastery with urgent news from his kingdom. A dispute had arisen between two provinces that threatened to escalate into conflict. In the past, such news would have immediately triggered a cascade of worried thoughts, hasty plans, and urgent commands. Instead, the king found himself listening to the report with complete presence, allowing the information to be received without immediately reacting. In the space of silence that followed the messenger's report, a solution emerged in the king's mind with perfect clarity, not a solution born from anxious thinking or desperate planning, but one that arose naturally from his expanded awareness. He gave simple, clear instructions to the messenger, instructions that would indeed resolve the conflict peacefully when implemented. This experience showed the king something profound about the relationship between silence and wisdom. When the mind is still, when we're not rushing to react or solve or fix, our innate wisdom has space to emerge. The answers we seek are often already present within us, waiting to be discovered in the silence between our thoughts. As his retreat neared its end, the king felt a profound gratitude arising in his heart, not just for the monk who had guided him, but for the difficult experiences that had driven him to seek this transformation. He understood now that his suffering had been a teacher, pointing him toward the very freedom he had discovered. Without the intensity of his restless mind, he might never have been motivated to undertake this journey into silence. But questions remained. How could he maintain this inner silence while returning to the demands of kingship? How could he integrate this profound transformation into a life filled with responsibilities and challenges? The monk's final teachings would provide answers that would not only guide the king, but would become wisdom for anyone seeking to live from a place of inner peace in a noisy world. On the 15th and final day of his retreat, the king approached the monk with a heart full of gratitude and a mind transformed beyond recognition. The man who had arrived at the monastery just 2 weeks earlier, restless, scattered, tormented by his own thoughts, no longer existed. In his place stood someone who had discovered the secret that wise beings throughout history have sought, the unshakable peace that comes from knowing one's true nature. "Respected teacher," the king said, his voice carrying a quality of depth and presence that had not been there before, "I have discovered why my mind was so troubled. I used to talk too much and spend enormous amounts of energy on people, often thinking negatively about them. This excessive talking and negative thinking wasted my time and made my mind disturbed. As a result of this behavior, I couldn't perform my tasks effectively and I started failing in almost everything. These continuous failures made me even more unhappy and easily annoyed." The monk listened with the same profound presence that had characterized their first meeting. But now the king could recognize and appreciate this quality of attention. He understood that the monk's listening was itself a form of teaching, a demonstration of how to be fully present with another person's experience. But now, the king continued, I feel like I'm truly living life to its fullest. I realized that before this experience, I was living it the wrong way. I also discovered that we don't have to force meditation or peace. Yes, it happens naturally when we stop interfering with our own essential nature. The silence has shown me that beneath all the mental noise, there is something vast and peaceful that has always been there. The monk smiled, an expression that held both joy for the king's discovery and recognition of a timeless truth being rediscovered. Your Majesty, what you have experienced is not unique to you. Many people in the world talk too much, and this excessive talking is still causing problems in their lives. You have learned what the Buddha himself taught, that our words can be our greatest power or our greatest weakness, depending on how consciously we use them. This moment represents one of the most important teachings in Buddhist philosophy. The recognition that individual suffering often reflects universal patterns of human behavior. The king's personal transformation was not just about his own peace, but about understanding something fundamental about the human condition. We all suffer from the same basic tendency to seek happiness outside ourselves, to fill every moment with mental activity, to mistake busyness for effectiveness. The monk then shared a story that would become central to Buddhist teachings about silence and self-knowledge. Once, a student asked Gautama Buddha why he was silent so often. The Buddha replied, I stay silent to dive deep within myself. Silence is the first step to truly knowing yourself. Without silence, self-discovery is impossible. When we are constantly talking, constantly thinking, constantly reacting, we never create the space necessary to encounter our own depths. Think about your own life for a moment. When did your most profound insights occur? Was it during moments of busy activity and constant talking? Or was it in quieter moments when your mind had space to settle and your deeper wisdom could emerge? The Buddha's teaching points to something that modern neuroscience is now confirming, that our most creative and wise insights often arise during periods of mental rest, not during periods of intense mental activity. The monk continued with words that would echo through the centuries. The first step is to be silent. Only speak when necessary, and you'll see that most of our talking, perhaps 90%, is harmful. It would be better if people didn't talk so much. This could reduce about 90% of human problems. When people become quieter, there are fewer fights, less restlessness, and less arguing. If both individuals in any relationship learn to stay silent and listen deeply, many problems in the world could be avoided. This teaching reveals something profound about the nature of human conflict. Most arguments and misunderstandings arise not from genuine differences of opinion, but from reactive speech, words spoken from emotion rather than wisdom, from the need to be right rather than the desire to understand. When we learn to pause before speaking, to choose our words consciously, to listen deeply before responding, the quality of all our relationships transforms. But the monk's teaching went even deeper into the nature of human consciousness. Someone who understands the value of silence can be at peace, even in a crowded place. Being alone can be like heaven, while the company of others can sometimes make us uncomfortable. This is because external peace is simply a reflection of internal peace. When we have found the silence within ourselves, we carry that sanctuary with us wherever we go. This teaching addresses one of the most common misconceptions about spiritual practice, that we need to withdraw from the world to find peace. True spiritual development is not about escaping from life, but about discovering the inner resources that allow us to remain centered and compassionate, regardless of external circumstances. The king was learning that he could return to his busy kingdom and maintain his inner silence because that silence had become part of his very being. The monk then offered practical guidance that would help the king integrate his transformation into daily life. It's important to start by finding peace within yourself and embracing silence, allowing your inner energy to flow. Invite your thoughts to settle down. If you wake up and feel disturbed by the presence of others, close your eyes and reconnect with your inner self. You'll find a sense of freshness inside yourself, because that's where your life originates. This practice of returning to inner silence throughout the day is fundamental to maintaining spiritual balance in an active life. It's not about meditating for hours, but about cultivating the ability to touch that place of inner stillness, even in the midst of busy activities. Like dipping into a refreshing spring, these moments of conscious silence restore our energy and clarity. The monk's final teaching carried the deepest wisdom of all. Look inward, because you are the ultimate ruler of your inner world. That's where life begins, and that's where happiness is born. When you look inside yourself, you'll encounter the depths of life itself. This inner journey is like watching your own consciousness go through its natural cycles, like the sun rising and setting. Every time you take this inner journey and return to activity, you'll feel refreshed. This teaching points to the ultimate truth of Buddhist philosophy, and that we each have the capacity to be free, regardless of our external circumstances. Freedom is not about changing the world around us, but about transforming our relationship to whatever arises. The king had discovered that the kingdom he most needed to rule was not the one outside himself, but the realm of his own consciousness. When you really connect with your inner self, the monk concluded, you'll find that talking doesn't disturb your peace. Instead, there's a constant feeling of calmness inside you. You can use words without breaking your inner silence. When you do this, your words will have a beautiful quality like music, and everything will be in harmony. Speaking this way will touch others deeply and help them find their own path to peace. The king now understood that his transformation was not an end, but a beginning. He would return to his kingdom not as the same restless ruler who had left, but as someone who had discovered the source of true power. His reign would become a demonstration of what happens when leadership flows from inner wisdom rather than external force, from silence rather than noise, from peace rather than anxiety. As the king prepared to leave the monastery and return to his kingdom, he carried with him something more valuable than all the gold and jewels in his treasury, the unshakable knowledge that true peace exists within every human being. His transformation would not only revolutionize his own reign, but would inspire countless others to discover the power that lies hidden in silence. But this ancient story is not just about a king from long ago. It's about you. Right now, in this very moment, you have access to the same silence that transformed his life. The same peace that Buddha discovered under the Bodhi tree exists within your own consciousness, waiting to be uncovered. The monk's prescription was simple but profound. Spend at least 20 minutes each day in silence. Not forced silence, not suppression of thoughts, but the gentle invitation to your mind to settle into its natural state of peace. Watch what happens when you create space between your thoughts. Notice the awareness that remains when mental chatter fades. Your journey into the power of silence begins now. Like the king, you may discover that what you've been seeking outside yourself has been waiting within you all along. The transformation is not only possible, it's your birthright. Thank you for joining us at Echoes of Dharma. May you find the peace that surpasses all understanding.